The day Winifred Chandler rode into Cutter's Creek, Texas, in the blazing summer of 1878, she arrived on a mule that was half dead and carrying everything she owned in a single battered trunk. And the first person she laid eyes on was a man standing in the middle of the main street who looked like he had never once in his life been inconvenienced by anything. And she knew immediately that he was going to be a problem. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and lean in the way that men who worked the land became lean, all hard lines and sun-bronzed skin, with dark hair that curled slightly where it met the collar of his shirt. He wore a worn leather vest over a white shirt that had seen better days, and his hat was pushed back on his head just enough that she could see the sharp set of his jaw and the flat, unreadable expression in his dark eyes as he watched her mule stumble to a halt in front of the general store. He did not offer to help. He simply watched her, and when she met his gaze, he looked away as if she were no more interesting than a passing cloud. Winifred Chandler was 26 years old, recently widowed, and had traveled 400 miles across the Texas flatlands with nothing but a letter of employment, a stubborn constitution, and the quiet but unbreakable certainty that she was going to make something of herself, even if the whole world seemed determined to make that difficult. She was not a woman who needed rescuing, and she had not come to Cutter's Creek looking for a hero. She had come for a job. The job was teaching. The letter in her trunk was from the school board of Cutter's Creek. A 4-person committee that had decided a proper schoolteacher was needed for the children of this growing cattle town, and Winifred had answered their advertisement in the Houston Chronicle with a letter that was apparently compelling enough to earn her the position. She had a formal education from a women's academy in Virginia. She had taught briefly in San Antonio before her brief and unhappy marriage to a man named Theodore Chandler, and she had experience with children ranging from 6 to 14 years of age. What the letter had not mentioned, what no one had thought to mention, was that the schoolhouse she was meant to teach in had burned down 6 weeks ago after a lightning strike, and the school board was still debating whether or not to rebuild it. She learned this from Mrs. Clara Beaumont, the postmaster's wife, who was a round, cheerful woman with red cheeks and an endless supply of slightly disastrous news delivered in a tone that suggested everything was perfectly fine. "The children have been making do," Clara told her, pouring coffee in the back room of the post office where Winifred had been brought after someone noticed her mule had sat down in the street and refused to stand up again. "Some of the mothers have been teaching at home, which is better than nothing. The building itself, well, just the foundation is left, and it's really quite solid, so that's encouraging." "The foundation is encouraging," Winifred repeated. "Very solid foundation." The Wilcox Ranch donated the timber for the original construction, and some people are saying Arthur might donate again if the board decides to rebuild. Arthur Wilcox, that's the man you probably noticed when you rode in. He owns the biggest spread in the county. The Double W, he's not unfriendly exactly, just quiet, keeps to himself. Winifred had noticed him, though she was not about to say so to Clara Beaumont. "And the school board, when do they meet?" "Oh, they meet every second Tuesday. That's 3 days from now. You could present yourself and ask about the school, and also about where you're going to be staying, because I assume no one arranged for accommodation." No one had arranged for accommodation. Winifred drank her coffee and looked out the small window at the wide, dusty street and the low wooden buildings of Cutter's Creek, which stretched in both directions along a dirt road that the summer heat had baked into something resembling cracked pottery. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon called the Silver Nail, a church, a small hotel, a doctor's office, and what appeared to be a feed store. Farther down the road she could see a barber shop and something that might have been a millinery. There were horses tied outside the saloon even at this hour of the morning, and somewhere in the distance she could hear cattle, which meant ranches nearby. It was smaller than San Antonio but bigger than nothing. It had a train stop 3 miles east, which Clara told her about with considerable pride, and it had a river, the Cottonwood Creek, that ran along the western edge of town and provided water for the ranches. It was, Clara said, a growing community. It has potential, Winifred said, which was the most honest thing she could say. She arranged to rent a room from Clara and her husband Bernard for $3 a week, which was more than she wanted to spend, but less than the hotel charged. Her mule recovered enough by the following morning to be stabled at the livery, and Winifred spent the 2 days before the school board meeting walking the town, introducing herself to shopkeepers and mothers and anyone else who seemed willing to speak with her, and building a picture of the place she had come to call home. She met the Garrity family, who had 4 children under 10 and a 5th on the way. She met old Harlan Dietz, who had been the previous schoolteacher before he retired and who still held very specific opinions about the correct way to teach arithmetic. She met Dr. Amos Fitch, a decent, quiet man from Ohio who had come west 15 years ago and never quite found his way back. She met the Ray's family, whose 2 children spoke both Spanish and English, and whose mother Rosa was one of the most capable women Winifred had ever encountered. She met Samuel Bright, who ran the general store and who was also the chair of the school board. She did not meet Arthur Wilcox again until the Tuesday meeting. He came in late, which surprised her because he did not look like a man who was habitually late. He came in just as Samuel Bright was calling the meeting to order in the back room of the general store, and he took a seat against the wall rather than at the table, and he crossed his arms over his chest and looked at nothing in particular with that same flat expression she had seen on his face in the street. There were 5 people at the table: Samuel Bright, a woman named Harriet Cook, who was one of the larger landowners, a young minister named Reverend Thomas Cole, and a man named Pete Garrity, who was the father of the 4 children under 10. Winifred had been invited to address the board, and she did so standing, because there was no chair offered, and she decided that standing was fine. She told them what she was qualified to teach, which was reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, and basic natural science. She told them she was prepared to begin instruction as soon as a facility was available, and that if the building could not be rebuilt immediately, she was willing to conduct classes in any appropriate space: a church hall, a large parlor, the open air if the weather permitted. She told them she believed that an educated population was the bedrock of any thriving community, and that the children of Cutter's Creek deserved consistent instruction. She was measured and clear and direct, and when she finished speaking, Samuel Bright nodded and Harriet Cook looked thoughtful and Reverend Cole smiled. "The board has already voted to rebuild," Samuel said. "We voted at the last meeting. The question is funding. We need timber and labor, and neither of those is free." "I'll provide the timber." The voice came from the wall, from Arthur Wilcox, who said it without uncrossing his arms or changing his expression, as if donating timber for a schoolhouse were about as consequential as noting that the weather was warm. Everyone looked at him. "Same as before," he said. "I've got pine on the western edge of the property that's been needing to come down anyway. The timber's good." Samuel Bright looked at Winifred with something that might have been satisfaction. "Well, that solves the primary problem." "What about labor? Some of the men in town could be organized on a working day, a Saturday." "I can help organize that," Harriet Cook said. "My husband's men can spare a day." The meeting went on for another 30 minutes, and by the end of it there was an actual plan. The school would be rebuilt on the existing foundation. The timber would come from the Wilcox Ranch. The labor would be voluntary from men around the county, and the date set was 3 Saturdays away. Until then, Winifred would conduct classes in the church hall with Reverend Cole's blessing. She was relieved. She was also aware that she had not said a single word to Arthur Wilcox, and that he had not said a single word to her, but that his offer of timber had solved her most pressing problem, and she found that unsettling in a way she could not entirely explain. After the meeting, she caught him outside near where his horse was tied. "Mr. Wilcox," she said. He turned. Up close he was even more imposing than he had seemed from a distance, not threateningly so, but in the way that the landscape itself was imposing, the way the sky over the plains felt too big to look at all at once. He was perhaps 31 or 32, with eyes that were a dark brownish green she had not expected given his general air of severity. "Miss Chandler," he said. He said it like he already knew her name, which she supposed he did given that the meeting had just introduced her to everyone in the room. "I wanted to thank you for the timber. It was generous." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she could not read. "It needed to come down regardless," he said. "The school needed wood. It's a practical arrangement. I appreciate it all the same. You don't need to." He turned back to his horse and checked the saddle in a way that suggested the conversation was over. Winifred stood there for a moment, watching him, and then she said, because she was curious and because she had never been particularly good at letting things go, "Have you always been like this?" He turned back. "Like what?" "Determinedly impersonal." Something moved across his face that might have been surprise, and then the flat expression settled back and he said, "I don't know what you mean, Miss Chandler. I offered the town timber and I attended a school board meeting. I'm not sure what personal qualities that requires." "No particular ones," she said pleasantly. "Good day, Mr. Wilcox." She walked back toward the Beaumont house with the afternoon sun pressing down on her shoulders, and she had the distinct and peculiar feeling that she had just begun something, though she could not have said exactly what. The church hall was warm and low-ceilinged and smelled of candle wax, but it was large enough for the 14 children who came on the first morning of classes, ranging from little me Garrity, who was 6 and missing 2 front teeth, to 15-year-old David Reyes, who stood a head taller than Winifred and was already talking about going to work at the feed store. Winifred had brought what she could from her trunk, a few primers, a geography book, a thin volume of American history, and had borrowed chalk and a board from Harlan Dietz, who had kept them out of sentiment and was glad to see them used again. The first week was difficult in the way that first weeks always were. Some children resisted sitting still. Some resisted the idea that education was relevant to their lives in any meaningful way. One boy named Clem Garrity, who was 8 and full of a specific kind of chaotic energy that Winifred recognized as intelligence with no direction, spent the first morning trying to put a grasshopper down the collar of the girl seated beside him. Winifred confiscated the grasshopper, released it outside, and gave Clem a multiplication problem so complex that he was silent for 20 minutes trying to solve it. He got it right. She gave him another one. By the end of the first week, she had learned the name and particular character of every child under her instruction, had organized them into 2 groups by ability rather than age, and had started each day with 15 minutes of reading aloud from whatever she could find, scripture from Reverend Cole's Bible, passages from her geography book, occasionally a poem that she knew by heart. The children liked the poetry more than she had expected. The second week she looked up from her desk one afternoon and found Arthur Wilcox standing in the doorway. He was watching the class with that same unreadable expression, one shoulder against the doorframe, hat in his hands. The children were working quietly on their letters, and he had apparently been standing there long enough that the ones closest to the door had noticed him without being distracted, which said something about either his stillness or their good behavior on that particular afternoon. "Mr. Wilcox," she said. Several heads came up from slates. "I wanted to see how things were going," he said, which surprised her because she had not taken him for the type to make social calls of any kind. "With the hall. Whether it's working out." "It's adequate," she said, "though the light in the afternoons is poor on the western side. I'll speak to Reverend Cole about the window hangings." "I'd appreciate that," he nodded. He looked at the children, really looked at them, not in a distant, assessing way, but with something that was almost, not quite, tenderness. And then he put his hat back on his head and said, "The building crew is confirmed for the 17th, 18 men. That's wonderful news. It'll take a few Saturdays, probably 3. You should have a proper building before the cold weather comes. Thank you, Mr. Wilcox." He left. and Winifred stared at the doorway where he had been for perhaps 3 seconds before a child named Lucy Bright, Samuel's youngest, asked her what a peninsula was, and she returned entirely to the matter at hand. The building crew arrived on the 17th as promised, and Winifred was there because she felt it was important to see, and also because she had brought a pot of coffee and a pan of corn bread from Clara Beaumont's kitchen, since Clara had declared that men working for free deserved feeding. There were 18 men from town and from the surrounding ranches, and Arthur Wilcox arrived first, at 6 in the morning, with 2 of his ranch hands and a wagon loaded with cut timber. He wore a simple cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he worked without stopping for the first 4 hours, lifting, measuring, hauling, directing the other men with quiet efficiency. He did not issue orders loudly or with authority. He simply moved to wherever something needed doing and did it, and the other men followed his example without apparently being asked. Winifred handed out coffee and corn bread around 9 in the morning, and when she reached Arthur Wilcox, she half expected him to wave her off. But he took the tin cup and the corn bread without ceremony and said, "It's good," after the first bite, and she decided to count that as a victory. "You know how to build," she observed. "I built most of the Double W myself," he said. "The main house, the barn, started with nothing but a parcel of land and a plan. When was that? 15 years ago." He was looking at the rising frame of the school as he said it, watching his men work. "I was 17. Winifred did the arithmetic quickly. "He was 32 then, or thereabouts. You built a ranch at 17. "I had my reasons to be busy." He said it in the tone of voice that people used when they did not want to be asked to elaborate, and Winifred, who had been asked to elaborate on her own private history often enough that she had developed strong opinions about being pushed, let it go. "Well," she said, "the school is grateful for your skills regardless of their origin." He looked at her then directly, and for a moment she could not tell what he was thinking at all, which was unusual because Winifred was generally a good reader of people. He was not hostile, he was not cold. He was something more guarded than either of those things, as if there were a wall that was not meant to keep people out but simply to keep something in. "You're different from what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone more anxious," he said, "coming all this way. New town, no building, no house. Most people would be rattled." "I was rattled," she said honestly. "I spent about 20 minutes after I learned the schoolhouse had burned down sitting in Clara Beaumont's parlor trying to decide if I'd made a terrible mistake. And then I finished my coffee and decided I hadn't." She smiled slightly. "Anxiety doesn't resolve anything. Action does." He looked at her a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and then he handed back his empty tin cup and went back to work. The school took 3 Saturdays, just as he had predicted. The building rose steadily. A single room with good high windows on both sides to maximize light, a proper plank floor, a stove in the corner, and a door that hung straight and closed without sticking. Better than the original, people said. The Wilcox timber was good, dense and straight-grained, and it would last. On the final Saturday, when the last nail was driven and the door was hung, someone produced a bottle and the men drank in a loose, cheerful crowd outside the finished building while the late afternoon light turned everything gold. Winifred stood at the front door and looked at the room inside, empty and clean and smelling of new wood, and felt something that was close to gratitude and also close to relief, and also something else that she did not examine too carefully. Arthur Wilcox was beside her without her noticing he had moved there. "It's a good room," she said. "Good acoustics," he said. "You'll be able to hear the back row without raising your voice. Did you think about that when you were building it?" "I thought about what a schoolroom needs." She turned to look at him and found him looking at the room, not at her. The light was doing something warm and impractical to his face, and she was aware, for the first time in a concrete rather than theoretical way, that Arthur Wilcox was a very handsome man who seemed entirely unconcerned with being so. "Mr. Wilcox," she said, "I would like to invite you to the official first day of classes in the new building if you would come, as a recognition of your contribution." He was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate the thought, but I shouldn't." "Why not?" "I'm not good in settings like that, public recognition." He said it flatly, not self-deprecatingly, just as a statement of fact. "It was practical support, Miss Chandler. It doesn't require ceremony." "I'm not offering ceremony," she said. "I'm offering coffee and a seat at the back of the room while 14 children read aloud. It's hardly formal." He looked at her then, and something in the flatness of his expression shifted very slightly, a small, nearly invisible adjustment, like a door opening an inch. "I'll think about it," he said. He came. He sat at the back, with his hat on his knee, and he watched the children read and listened to Winifred explain the difference between a river and a tributary using a drawing she had made on the board. And he stayed for exactly 1 hour before leaving quietly. And he did not say anything afterward, but 2 days later she found a stack of books on the front step of the schoolhouse. A proper atlas, 2 readers, and a thin volume of collected American verse, with a note that said only, "These might be useful. A.W." Winifred read the note 3 times. She was not a woman who made too much of small things. She had been married to a man who had been charming, and then unkind, and then absent, and she had learned from that experience to be careful with her own heart, to examine her feelings with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything else. Theodore Chandler had been dead for 18 months, lost to a fever, and she had mourned him in a practical way, mourned what the marriage could have been more than what it was, and she had packed her grief with her books and her teaching credentials and come west. She was not looking for love. She was quite clear on this point. But she found, over the following weeks, that she was paying close attention to Arthur Wilcox in ways that had nothing to do with professional gratitude. He came to town once a week, usually on Fridays, to the general store. He was always alone. He spoke to people he met in a courteous, minimal way, and he never lingered. But he had begun, when he passed the school, to slow his horse slightly at the window, and once she had caught him at it, and he had tipped his hat at her through the glass with a gravity that was almost comical, and she had smiled at the board so her students would not see. She learned things about him from other people, because he himself volunteered almost nothing. Clara Beaumont was an excellent source and completely unashamed about being one. Arthur Wilcox had come to the territory at 17 with a younger brother named James, she learned. They had built the Double W together. James had married at 21, a woman named Caroline, who had died in childbirth 2 years later along with the baby. James himself had died of a horse fall the following spring. Arthur had been alone since then, which meant close to 10 years. The ranch hands were good men. A Mexican vaquero named Esteban who had been with him since the beginning, and 3 others, but they were employees, not company. "He doesn't come to social events," Clara said, in the tone of someone reporting a minor town tragedy. "He came to church twice after James died and then stopped. He's not unkind about it, he just doesn't come. Bernard thinks he's the loneliest man in 3 counties. Winifred thought about that. She thought about 17-year-old Arthur Wilcox with a younger brother and a plan and a piece of land, building something out of nothing. She thought about what it would do to a person to build all of that, and then watch it become something he inhabited entirely alone. She thought, too, about the books he had left on the step, about the way he had sat at the back of the room with his hat on his knee and listened to children read. At the end of October, there was a social, a harvest dance at the community hall, which was the largest space in town, and which Clara Beaumont had helped to organize with flowers from someone's garden and lanterns strung along the ceiling, and a fiddle player from a ranch outside town. Everyone came to these, Clara said. It was tradition. Winifred wore her best dress, which was a deep blue-green that she had bought 2 years ago in San Antonio, and which was not particularly fashionable but fit her well and made her feel like herself. She danced with Samuel Bright's eldest son, who was 20 and very earnest, and with Pete Garrity, who stepped on her foot twice and apologized both times with such genuine horror that she laughed, and with Dr. Fitch, who danced with quiet competence and told her she had done wonders with the children in the past 2 months. Arthur Wilcox was not there. She had not expected him to be. But she was aware of his absence in a way she had not been aware of the absence of anyone else she knew in town, and she recognized this awareness for what it was, and spent about 10 minutes in a corner with a glass of cider, conducting a very serious internal conversation with herself about what she was doing. She was doing nothing, she concluded. She was noticing someone, that was allowed. The following Friday she saw him at the general store and she said, "You missed the harvest dance." He was examining a coil of rope with the thoroughness of a man who either genuinely cared about the rope or wanted to avoid making eye contact. "I heard it went well." "It did. The fiddle player was quite good. You would have enjoyed it." "I don't dance, Miss Chandler." "You don't know that. You might if you tried." He looked up from the rope and there it was again, that slight adjustment in the flat expression, that inch of open door. "I know myself reasonably well," he said. "Do you?" She said it lightly, not pressing, just leaving it there. "I think sometimes what we know about ourselves is just a story we've been telling for so long it feels like fact." He was very still for a moment. Then he put the rope down and said, "That's a somewhat aggressive observation for a Friday morning in a general store." "I'm a school teacher," she said. "I'm professionally committed to the idea that things should be examined. And am I one of the things you're examining?" It was the most direct thing he had said to her, and it caught her slightly off guard, not because it was pointed but because it was honest, and she had the impression that directness cost him something, that it was not his natural mode to ask that kind of question out loud. "I find you interesting," she said, which was true. "I don't apologize for that." He looked at her for a long moment and then he said, "Come to the ranch on Sunday. I'll show you the western timber section before the men come in to harvest the rest of the pine." She blinked. "That's an invitation." "It is. To walk through timber." "There's also the river view from the north pasture," he said, and the tone of his voice was so precisely neutral that she could not tell if he was joking or not. "I'll come on Sunday," she said. She rode out to the Double W on a borrowed horse because her mule was strictly transportation for in-town distances, and she was not going to arrive at a working ranch on a mule if she could possibly help it. The Double W was 8 miles west of town along a road that followed Cottonwood Creek, and the approach to the main house was through a long flat expanse of grama grass that turned golden in October, wide and still under a pale blue sky, with a line of cottonwood trees along the creek glowing yellow. The ranch itself was more impressive than she had imagined. The main house was solidly built, low and long, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. There was a large barn, a bunkhouse, a chicken yard, a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter, and farther out, corrals where horses stood in the morning light. Everything was well maintained in the way that things were maintained when the person who built them cared about their continued integrity. Arthur Wilcox came out of the barn when she rode up, wiping his hands on a cloth, and he looked at her on the borrowed horse, a good-natured bay gelding named Buck, according to the livery stable with something that might have been approval, though it was delivered in the restrained register that seemed to be his primary expressive mode. "You ride well," he said. "I grew up in Virginia," she said, dismounting. "There is not much else to do in Virginia except ride and embroider, and I was always much better at the riding." He took Buck's reins and led the horse to the corral while she walked beside him, and the morning was cool and clean, and the smell of the grass and the cottonwood trees along the creek was something she thought she might want to remember for a long time. Esteban appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse, a wiry, observant man of about 40 with a dark beard and a formal courtesy that Winifred liked immediately. He spoke to Arthur in Spanish, quick and easy, and Arthur answered in the same language with an ease that surprised her and then didn't, because she was beginning to understand that Arthur Wilcox had depths that were easy to miss if you only looked at the surface of him. "Esteban says the north pasture fence line is good," Arthur told her. "We can take the long way to the timber." They walked, which she had not expected but was glad of, because it meant she could look at everything without the distraction of managing a horse. The ranch was larger than it appeared from the house. The pastures went back for what felt like miles, the creek running along one edge with its yellow trees, the land rising slightly to the west, where the timber section was a dark line of pine against the paler sky. He talked more than she had expected, and she understood after a while that he talked easily about the land and the ranch and the animals, but with the studied neutrality of someone who had learned to describe the practical without touching the personal. He showed her where the pine had been cut for the school, the stumps clean and level, and the remaining trees standing dense and dark above them. He showed her a low place along the creek where deer came in the evenings. He pointed out a red-tailed hawk sitting on a fence post 30 yards off, and they watched it together without speaking, until it lifted and carried itself over the tree line in a long, clean arc. "You love this place," she said. "It's mine," he said, which was not exactly an answer. "Is that the same thing?" He considered this with the seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "I suppose it might be," he said. "I don't know if love is something I do naturally." It was the first time he had said anything like that, anything that touched on the interior rather than the exterior, and she was careful not to react to it too obviously. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means I'm better at working than I am at feeling things in ways that can be expressed." He said it without self-pity, just factually, as if he were reporting a characteristic of the land or the weather. James was always better at it. He could walk into a room and know exactly how everyone in it felt and what to say about it. I was always the one who knew what needed building or fixing. And when James was gone, there was no one to be the other half. He was quiet for a long moment, something like that. "I'm sorry about James," she said, "and about Caroline. You heard, Clara Beaumont." "Of course," but he didn't seem angry about it, just resigned. "It was a long time ago." "Grief doesn't always observe a timeline," she said. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that was neither the flat exterior nor the guarded interior, but something else: recognition, perhaps, or relief at not being argued with. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They walked back to the house in a companionable silence that felt entirely different from the impersonal silence of their early encounters. And when she mounted Buck to ride back to town, he stood at the corral gate and looked up at her with the late morning sun behind him and said, "Would you come again?" "Yes," she said, without pausing to be careful about it. She went back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. And then on a Wednesday when he came to town, she walked out of the school at the noon hour to find him at the post office, and she said she had found a poem she thought he might like. And she read it to him right there on the porch of the post office, which was a small poem about a hawk by an American poet she had studied in Virginia. And he listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance. And when she finished, he said, "Read it again." So she did. By November, she knew things about him that she doubted many people knew. She knew he had a precise, methodical mind that found satisfaction in problems that could be solved with thought and effort. She knew he read, not widely but carefully, and he retained what he read with the thoroughness of someone who approached books the same way he approached building, each thing in its proper place. She knew he was patient with animals and with children and with problems, and impatient with abstraction and sentiment, and people who did not mean what they said. She knew he woke before dawn every day and worked until dark, and that this was not discipline imposed but pleasure genuine, that the work itself was what he wanted. She knew, too, that something was happening between them that was neither the professional courtesy they had begun with nor the cautious acquaintance it had been, but something with an undertow, a pull that was quiet and steady and getting stronger. She was careful not to rush it because she could see that rushing it would be the wrong approach entirely. Arthur Wilcox was not a man who could be pushed. He was a man who needed to come to things at his own pace, in his own way, and who would resist with considerable force anything that felt like pressure. So she was patient, and she was present, and she waited to see what he would do. What he did in mid-November was show up at the church hall where she was working late one evening grading her students' compositions by lantern light, and he stood in the doorway and said, "I was passing," which they both knew was not quite true since the church hall was not on the way to anywhere from the livery stable, where he kept his horse when he was in town. He had a paper-wrapped package under his arm which he set on her desk, and which turned out to contain a further 3 books, a proper American history text, a volume of Shakespeare, and something that surprised her entirely, which was a book on botany and natural science. "Where did you find this?" she said, holding up the botany volume. "Ordered it from San Antonio," he said. "The children were asking you questions about plants last time I was in that you couldn't answer from memory." She looked at him. He was standing slightly awkwardly, which she had come to recognize as his version of uncertainty, the slight hesitation in how he held himself when he was in territory that was not entirely familiar. "Arthur," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt him notice it, a small adjustment in his stillness. "I am very glad you came to this town," she said, and she meant it in every way it could be meant. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "I'm glad you came too," and the way he said it, low and level and with a weight behind it that the words themselves hardly seemed sufficient to carry, made her heart do something she had not given it permission to do. She could see him deciding something. She could see it the way you could see weather changing, the light shifting and the air thickening, the whole character of the moment transforming into something about to break. "I should tell you something," he said. "Tell me. I don't believe in love." He said it straight, not apologetically, not as a confession but as an accounting of facts. "I've thought about it. I've watched people. James had it. I know he did. I could see it with him and Caroline. I don't think I have that in me. I think I missed something that other people got, some kind of capacity, and it's been long enough that I've stopped looking for it." Winifred looked at him for a long moment, her hands folded on the desk, the lantern light soft between them. And then she said, "That's fine. I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm just asking you to feel it." He looked at her as if she had said something in a language he did not speak. Or perhaps as if she had said something in a language he had given up speaking so long ago he had forgotten he knew it. "Feel it," he repeated. "Whatever is actually happening when you drive 8 miles on a Wednesday to bring me books," she said calmly. "Whatever you feel when you show me where the deer come down to the creek, or when you sit at the back of my classroom and watch the children read. Whatever that is, I'm not naming it. You don't have to name it. I'm just saying you don't have to decide in advance that you can't have it." The silence that followed was the longest silence she had ever sat in with him, and she did not try to fill it. "You're not what I expected," he said again, and this time it sounded different from the first time he had said it, less like an observation and more like something he was only beginning to understand. "What did you expect this time?" she asked. "Someone who would argue," he said, "or persuade or be hurt." "None of those seemed useful," she said. He came to the desk then, and he was close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes in the lantern light, and he said, "What do I do with that?" "Just feel it," she said again gently. "That's all." He reached out and put his hand over hers on the desk, just his hand over both of hers, warm and steady and deliberate, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he is only now allowing himself to actually see. "All right," he said quietly. He did not kiss her that night. He straightened up after a moment and said good night in his low, level voice and walked back out into the dark, and Winifred sat at her desk for a very long time before she could concentrate on her students' compositions. Something had shifted, something fundamental and irreversible, the kind of shift that rearranges everything after it. In the following days he sought her company with a quiet purposefulness that he did not try to make casual. He rode into town on days when he had no business there and found reasons to be near the school. He asked her questions, real questions, not conversational ones, about her life, her childhood in Virginia, her years of teaching, her marriage, and he listened to the answers with the focused attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, which was itself a kind of tenderness. She told him about Theodore Chandler in plain language. The way the charm had worn away to reveal something underneath that was smaller and meaner than she had expected. The loneliness of being married to someone who didn't see you. The peculiar grief of mourning a marriage you had never quite had. She told it without dramatics and without self-pity, and he listened without trying to fix it or minimize it. And when she was done, he said, "You deserved better." And the simplicity of it, the absolute conviction in his voice undid something in her. "So did you," she said. He took that in slowly. "I never had enough to feel I was owed better." "You built a ranch at 17, she said. "You built a school, you kept your brother's memory in the name of the place, the double W, William and James, was it, or something else?" He looked faintly surprised. "Arthur and James," he said. "Arthur and William Wilcox. James went by his middle name." A pause. "No one has ever asked that. People should ask more," she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her temple, a gesture so private and so gentle that she went completely still, and he looked at his own hand as if surprised by it. And then he looked at her, and the door was not cracked an inch anymore. It was wide open, and on the other side of it was everything he had been keeping so carefully contained for so long. "Winifred," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality she had not heard before from anyone. Not the polite address of a professional relationship or the fond familiarity of friendship, but something that was her. Specifically, uniquely, the person she actually was and had always been trying to be. "I hear it," she said softly. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "You're doing it," she told him. He kissed her on the porch of the church hall on a cold November evening with the first frost glittering on the ground and the stars very bright overhead. And it was not a cautious or tentative kiss, but a certain one. The kind of kiss that knows exactly what it means. And she brought her hand up to the front of his coat and held on and felt the winter air on her face and the warmth of him, and thought that she had been right, that this was something she had known was coming from the first morning in Cutter's Creek. December arrived cold and clear and turned the Cottonwood Creek into something silver and beautiful, and Winifred conducted her classes with the stove in the corner burning steadily and the new windows letting in the low winter light, and her students were making real progress. Clem Garrity had moved past multiplication into long division and had the look of a child who was beginning to understand that his own mind was an instrument of some power. David Reyes had decided he was not going to work at the feed store after all, that he wanted to read law, which Winifred considered the best news she had heard all year. Arthur came to the school on Fridays now as a habit, sitting at the back for an hour or two, occasionally answering a child's question about ranching or cattle, or the land in ways that Winifred found herself weaving into lessons with a fluency that came from knowing him well enough to understand what he had said and why it mattered. The children adored him in the sideways manner that children adored adults who were consistent and calm and took them seriously, not showy about it, not performing affection, but present in a way that children recognized as real. Clem Garrity in particular had adopted him as a kind of silent hero, tracking Arthur's movements around the classroom with an attention that Arthur pretended not to notice, and Winifred watched with considerable amusement. "That boy is going to build something extraordinary someday," Arthur said one Friday afternoon after the children had gone home. "I think you might be right," Winifred said, wiping the chalk from the board. "He reminds me of someone." "Don't say it." She smiled at the board. "I didn't say anything." He crossed the room and stood behind her, and she turned to find him close, very close, in the way that had become familiar, the way he occupied space near her differently from how he occupied space near other people, with a specificity that she understood was not an accident. "Come to the ranch for Christmas," he said. "Have Christmas dinner with me." "Just us?" she asked. "And Esteban and the men," he said. I'm not saying it would be," he stopped, which was unlike him, the man who said exactly as much as he meant and no more, now searching for a word. "I want you there," he said finally. "In the place that's mine, I want you to be there." "I'll be there," she said. Christmas at the Double W was the kind of thing she would describe to herself later as unexpectedly perfect. Esteban's wife Catalina had come from her family's home for the holiday and had brought tamales and sweet bread, and a warmth that filled the ranch house kitchen in a way that made Winifred feel immediately at home. There were 4 ranch hands young men, all of them, who were bashful about having a woman at the table and overcompensated by being extremely polite. And there was a very large goose that Arthur had apparently shot himself, and which Catalina had roasted with herbs and dried chilies that made it something remarkable. Arthur sat at the head of the table and watched the meal happen around him with an expression she had learned to read by now, the particular quality of his stillness, when something was making him feel more than he was currently willing to say. He helped Catalina clear the dishes, and he poured coffee with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything, and late in the afternoon when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Esteban and Catalina were settled in the kitchen, he and Winifred sat on the covered porch in their coats watching the last light fall out of the sky over the winter pasture. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About what I've been doing all these years." "Working," she said. "Working," he agreed, "building, maintaining, and thinking that was enough because I believed I wasn't capable of more than that." He was looking at the horizon, at the last streak of color over the western hills, and his voice had the quality of something being said for the first time. "I was wrong about that. Were you? I've been feeling things for months, Winifred. You told me to feel it, and I've been feeling it, and I don't know what to do with the fact that you were right and I was wrong." She looked at him. The cold was sharp and clean, and she could see his breath in the air between them. "What does it feel like?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and the last light was behind him, and his face was very serious and very open in a way she had only ever seen it here with her, and he said, "It feels like the land when the rain finally comes after a long, dry summer. It feels like something that was always supposed to be true finally becoming true." She reached across and took his hand, which was large and warm and roughened from work, and she held it in both of hers and said, "That is love, Arthur." He looked at their hands. "I know," he said, and the way he said it, the weight of recognition in it, the quiet undoing of a long, long certainty made her eyes sting in a way she had not expected, and she was glad the cold air gave her a reason to blink. "I still don't know how to do it properly," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "But I think that's all right. I think perhaps no one does." He looked at her, and then he leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers, just that, forehead to forehead in the cold December evening, and he said very quietly, "Stay." And she understood that he was not just asking her to stay on the porch. "Ask me properly," she said, just as quietly. He pulled back and looked at her with the directness that was the most essentially himself thing about him. No deflection, no distance, just the full weight of his attention aimed entirely at her. And he said, "Will you marry me, Winifred Chandler? I have a ranch and I know how to build things, and I am apparently capable of love, which I did not believe for most of my adult life and which I attribute entirely to you, and I would very much like you to be here permanently." She laughed, which was not what he had probably expected, and the laugh was full and real and warm in the cold air. And then she said, "Yes, I will marry you, Arthur Wilcox. That is the answer." He looked, for one unguarded moment, like a man who had been handed something so valuable he was not sure his hands were steady enough to hold it. And then he pulled her into his arms on the December porch of the Double W, and she went into them as if she had always known they would be where she ended up. They told Clara Beaumont first, because Clara would have been genuinely heartbroken to find out any other way, and Clara's response was to produce a bottle of elderberry wine from somewhere in the back of the post office, and insist on immediately drinking to their health while telling them at length about her feelings on the matter, which were uniformly positive and loudly expressed. Bernard Beaumont shook Arthur's hand with both hands and told him he was a lucky man in a tone that was so sincere it was almost solemn, and Arthur received this with the serious attention he gave everything, and said that he knew. They were married in the spring, in late April of 1879, when the cottonwood trees along the creek were in leaf, and the plains were as green as they would ever get before the summer drove the color out of them. Reverend Cole performed the ceremony in the church, which was full. Clara had apparently told everyone in 3 counties, and a number of people Arthur had not seen in years came to the wedding, which he bore with remarkable good humor, standing at the front of the church in a dark suit that he wore with the precise discomfort of a man who associated formal clothing with funerals. Winifred wore a cream-colored dress that Rosa Reyes had helped her make, with small blue flowers embroidered at the collar and cuffs, and she carried wildflowers from the creek, the only thing available in April and entirely perfect for that reason. She walked to the front of the church alone, because she had no family in Texas, and she did it steadily and without hesitation. And when she arrived beside Arthur, he looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded that Reverend Cole, who was trying to get through the opening words of the ceremony, paused for a moment and smiled before continuing. Esteban was Arthur's best man, which was right and fitting, and Catalina wept with a generosity that lent the whole proceeding an emotional weight that Winifred appreciated. The children from the school sat in the middle rows, and several of them had brought flowers they had picked on the way to church, and Mee Garrity had made a drawing of the occasion on her slate, which she kept showing to the child beside her throughout the entire ceremony. When Reverend Cole declared them married and Arthur kissed his wife, the church erupted in a noise that Arthur had definitely not anticipated, and he pulled back from the kiss looking slightly startled, and Winifred laughed and said into his ear, "Welcome to having people in your life." And he shook his head slowly, but she could see the corner of his mouth turning up. After the ceremony, there was a dinner at the community hall, 3 long tables, more food than any reasonable group of people could eat, the fiddle player from the harvest dance who had apparently been hired again, and an atmosphere of festivity that spilled out the doors into the spring evening. Arthur danced with his wife, which he had claimed he could not do, and which turned out not to be entirely accurate. He was deliberate and careful about it rather than graceful, but he kept the beat and he held her properly, and he looked at her throughout with an intensity that made Clara Beaumont press her hand to her heart from across the room. He danced twice. The second time he said, "I still think dancing is an impractical activity." "And yet here you are," Winifred said. "Here I am," he agreed and turned her carefully through the steps. They went home being the double W, which Winifred had moved into on the day before the wedding, which had scandalized precisely nobody because they were all adults, and this was 1879, and everyone in Cutter's Creek had known for 6 months what the situation was, and the ranch was quiet after the noise of the celebration, the dark spring sky very large above it, and the cottonwoods rustling along the creek. She stood on the porch and looked out at the land, at what she could see of it in the dark, and it felt different from how it had felt when she first came here as a guest. It felt like something that was hers now, not in the way of possession but in the way of belonging, the two-directional thing, she belonged to it and it to her. Arthur stood beside her, and they were quiet together in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had already said all the most important things. "You're happy," he said. "Extremely," she said. He stopped, assembling it. "I don't have the right word." "Try, content," he said, "in the deepest possible way, which I think might be more than happy." "I think you might be right," she said. He brought his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the spring night was cool and smelled of grass and creek water and distance, and the hawk cried somewhere to the west. And this was where the story of Winifred Chandler arriving on a half-dead mule in the summer of 1878 had arrived. She taught for a full school year, and then a second year after that, which brought her students further along than she had hoped, with David Reyes reading law books borrowed by mail from a legal firm in Houston, and Clem Garrity doing mathematics 2 years above his age, and little me with all her new teeth grown in reading, aloud with a confidence and expression that made the room pay attention. In the second year, she hired a young woman named Betsy Walsh, newly arrived from Missouri with a teaching certificate, to take over one of the reading groups, because Winifred was with child and her afternoons were becoming difficult, and she had decided that she would keep teaching through the summer and step back in the fall when the baby came. Arthur's response to the news of the pregnancy had been, characteristically, a silence of about 45 seconds followed by a very direct look and the words, "You're well." And when she said she was perfectly well and not the least worried, he said, "Good," and then spent the following hour doing absolutely everything she had been planning to do that morning while she sat in the kitchen and drank her tea and watched him with the affection that had settled into her bones like something she had been carrying all her life and only now understood the purpose of. "I can still move," she told him. "I know you can." "Then why are you chopping all the wood?" "Because I want to," he said. She let him chop the wood. The boy was born in November of 1880 in the ranch house with Dr. Fitch in attendance and Catalina present as a matter of course, because Catalina had established very firmly after the wedding that she would be involved in all significant events at the W whether invited or not. He was a healthy boy with his mother's hair and his father's eyes, and the general air of a person who had arrived with strong opinions, and no intention of being quiet about them. Arthur held his son in the November afternoon light with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and the expression on his face was something Winifred stored away in the most carefully kept part of herself, because it was the full, unguarded, unreserved version of every slight opening she had watched in the flat surface of him over the past 2 years. He was not a man who cried, but he was a man who went still in a way that meant more than tears. "William," Winifred said, which she had decided months ago and told Arthur, who had received it the way he received all the most important things, quietly, with his whole attention, as if making certain he understood the weight of it correctly. "William," he repeated and looked at his son. "After the other half of the W," she said. He looked up at her with the open door wide and everything through it visible, all of it, the grief and the loss and the decade of working in silence and the books on the schoolhouse step, and the hawk on the fence post, and the Christmas dinner and her walking to the front of the church with wildflowers, all of it at once in the direct, dark eyes of Arthur Wilcox, who had believed he did not love and now knew without question that he did. "Thank you," he said, and it was a larger thank you than it appeared. "You're welcome," she said. William Wilcox turned out to have his father's methodical mind and his mother's stubbornness, which was a combination that proved in his early years to be both impressive and exhausting. He was walking at 11 months and causing structural damage to the kitchen at 14, and at 2 years old he could identify every tool in the barn, and was working through the alphabet with an intensity that Winifred privately found hilarious, and that Arthur watched with the suppressed pride of a man who would never say out loud that his child was extraordinary, but who clearly believed it completely. Cutter's Creek grew. The train stop became a proper station in 1881, and with it came new families, new businesses, and a pressure on the school to expand. Winifred worked with the school board to add a second classroom, and this time the building work came not just from Arthur but from half the town, because the school had become a point of community pride that Winifred had not entirely planned but was not at all sorry about. Betsy Walsh became the permanent second teacher, and she was excellent. Arthur had taken on 2 new ranch hands that year and was running more cattle than the W had ever managed, which meant he was occupied from before dawn well into the dark 6 days of 7. But he was never, Winifred noticed, occupied in the way he had been before, the working as a means of filling space, the busyness as a substitute for presence. He worked hard and then he came home, and he came home the way a person came home when home was the thing they were working toward. He came in one evening in the spring of 1882, when William was walking sturdily and already had the beginning of Arthur's precise observant habits, and Winifred was reading on the porch in the last light, and he sat down beside her and rested his forearms on his knees and looked out at the long view of the pasture and the creek and the cottonwoods, and he said, Are you happy here, Winifred? Truly. She put her book down and looked at him. Why are you asking? I want to be certain, he said. Not because I doubt it. I know you well enough to know when you're unhappy. I'm asking because I want to hear you say it. She understood. This was not anxiety. This was the man she had married, making certain that the reality they were living in was mutual, that he had not, in his pleasure in it, made it too much about himself. I'm the happiest I have ever been in my life, she said, and she said it fully, without qualification. I have the school, which is my work and which I love. I have this ranch, which is extraordinary. I have William, who is apparently determined to test the limits of everything I know. And I have you, Arthur Wilcox, who I fell in love with somewhere between a pile of timber and a poem about a hawk, and who is the finest man I have ever known. He looked at her for a long moment, the evening light on his face, and said, I fell in love with you the morning you arrived in this town. She stared at him. You did not. You didn't even look at me. I looked, he said. You came in on a half-dead mule with a battered trunk, and you looked at this town like you owned it, and I thought I had never seen anyone so certain they were going to be all right. He paused. I didn't know what to do with that, so I looked away. You looked away for quite a long time, she said. I did, he agreed. You could have simply introduced yourself. I could have, he said, and the almost smile was at the corner of his mouth. But you found your way to me regardless. I am a school teacher, she said. I am professionally committed to the idea that things should be examined. He laughed, which was still a rare enough event that it struck her each time as something worth paying attention to, low and real and contained, like most things about him, but utterly genuine. They sat together on the porch until the dark came fully, and the stars appeared over the pasture, and the first spring insects began their sound in the grass. And William, who had been put to bed an hour ago, called from inside the house with the authority of a toddler who had strong feelings about being awake, and Arthur got up to go to him with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had always known how to be needed, and had only recently learned to be glad of it. Through 1882 and into 1883, the county changed around them. The cattle market in Abilene was strong, and the Double W expanded, adding acreage along the creek that Arthur had been watching for 2 years. New settlers arrived with the railroad, and some of them were Mexican families whose children came to the school and were welcomed there. And some of them were families from back east who found the frontier harder than they had expected. And some of them were people who had been traveling west for reasons they did not explain, and who were glad to find a town that was more settled than what they had left. There was a dispute that year over grazing land between the Double W and a neighboring ranch belonging to a man named Garrett Cole, no relation to the Reverend, who was an aggressive negotiator and a sore loser, and who had the habit of letting his cattle drift onto other people's range and claiming confusion. Arthur handled it in his usual way, which was to document everything, speak once directly and clearly, and when that failed, take the matter to the county land office with records so thorough and legible that the adjudicator said it was the most organized land dispute filing he had seen in 20 years. Garrett Cole was required to move his fence line 40 yards east and pay a fine for the trespass. He was not happy about it. He rode past the school one afternoon and said something unpleasant to Winifred about her husband that she received with the expression she used for students who were testing boundaries, perfectly calm, making it absolutely clear that nothing about this was working. And she told him that if he had complaints about the land adjudicators ruling, he was welcome to pursue them through the proper legal channels, and that he had a good day ahead of him if he chose to behave like a reasonable adult. He rode off. She went back inside and taught her students about the Missouri River. She told Arthur about it that evening and watched him absorb it with the focused attention he gave anything that touched his family, and she said, "It's handled, Arthur. I handled it." "I know you did," he said. "Then you can stop looking like you're planning something." He looked at her. "I'm not planning anything, I'm feeling things." She nearly laughed. "What kind of things?" "Proud," he said. and a specific kind of angry that I intend to leave alone because you told me it's handled, and I believe you. And I am working on the idea that believing you is more useful than acting on feelings that are not constructive. That is remarkable personal growth, she said. Don't be smug about it, he said. She was a little smug about it. In the fall of 1883, Winifred discovered she was expecting again, and this time the pregnancy was easier than the first, and she continued teaching through the winter reduced hours, Betsy covering the mornings, and the school went on without interruption. William, now 3, had become deeply attached to Esteban and could be found most mornings at the corral watching Esteban work with the horses and asking the kind of unceasing questions that only 3-year-olds ask, and Esteban answered all of them with perfect seriousness, which William appreciated. The second child arrived in the spring of 1884, a girl this time, with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and a placidity that was so unlike William's early intensity that Winifred spent the first week faintly suspicious of it before concluding that she simply had a calm baby, and that this was allowed. They named her Clara, for Clara Beaumont, who was so moved by this that she cried for 20 minutes in the post office, and then baked 3 pies in a state of emotional tribute that she distributed to the Wilcox household over the following week. William received his sister with the philosophical equanimity of a child who had been told about her for months, and had therefore had time to form a position. He observed her carefully, touched her hand with one finger, and announced to his father that she was small but acceptable, which Arthur received without comment while Winifred bit the inside of her cheek. The school at Cutter's Creek was thriving by 1884. 22 students, 2 teachers, a library of 40 books, and a reputation in the county for being a place where children actually learned things. David Reyes had gone to Houston to pursue his legal studies and wrote letters back to Winifred that were increasingly full of the particular excitement of someone finding out that the world was as interesting as they had hoped. Clem Garrity had turned 14 and was assisting Harlan Dietz with surveying work, calculating land measurements with the same absorbed pleasure he had once brought to long division, and Harlan had told Winifred that the boy had the makings of a proper surveyor or engineer. She rode out one afternoon to tell Arthur about Clem's prospects, and found him in the western field mending a fence line with one of the hands, working steadily in the autumn sun, and he looked up when she rode in, and the expression on his face was the one she never stopped noticing, the unreserved openness, the welcome that was not performed but simply true. "Clem Garrity is going to be a surveyor," she said, dismounting. "I'm not surprised," he said. "You said that last time I told you something about one of the children. Because I'm rarely surprised by them," he said, handing the fence tool to the hand and walking toward her. "They're your students. You've been telling them their minds are instruments for 3 years. Eventually they start to believe it. That is possibly the nicest thing you've said about my teaching. I've said many nice things about your teaching. You've said it's effective," she said. "Once you said it was impressive. This is nicer." He looked at her with the corner of his mouth doing the almost smile, and he took the horse's reins and tied them to the fence post, and then he turned back to her and said, "Your teaching is extraordinary. You took a burned-down school and 14 children, and turned them into people who know what they're capable of. I think about that sometimes, what it would have meant to me at 10 or 12 to have someone who believed that about me as plainly as you believe it about your students." He paused. "I would have been a different person." "Maybe," she said, "but I think you would still have built the ranch. I think that's intrinsic." "Maybe," he said, "but I might have known sooner that it didn't have to be done alone." She stepped toward him and put her hand flat against his chest, above his heart, and felt it steady and solid and entirely his. "You're not alone now," she said. "No," he said, "I'm not." And he covered her hand with his. The same gesture as that November evening in the church hall, his hand over hers, but everything that had changed between then and now carried in it. Clara Beaumont, the woman, passed away in the spring of 1885 from a fever that took her in 3 days, which was a grief that landed hard on the town, and harder on Winifred and hardest of all, perhaps on Arthur, who had grown into genuine fondness for Clara over the years, and who showed his grief the way he showed everything, quietly, without display, working harder and saying less, and coming to bed in the evenings with the particular heaviness of a man carrying something heavy. Winifred did not try to fix it. She sat with him in the evening quiet, and she let him be what he was, and she was present, which was what she had done from the beginning, and it was what he needed. After a week he said, "She was the first person in this town who saw you clearly," and Winifred understood that he was talking about more than Clara's instinct for people, that he was saying something about what it meant to have been seen clearly himself. "She saw you too," Winifred said. "I know," he said. "That's what I'm saying." Bernard Beaumont continued as postmaster and became a quiet regular presence at the W Sunday dinners, which by 1885 had expanded to include Esteban and Catalina, the Reverend Cole, who had become a genuine friend, Dr. Fitch, and occasionally the Ray's family when Rose's husband Mateo was not traveling for work. It was the family that Arthur had never had and had stopped expecting, and he presided over it at the head of the table with the same focused attention he brought to the ranch, making certain everyone was cared for and nothing was lacking, and doing it in the way that was most entirely himself. William, at 5, had become a serious child of particular intensity, who spent his time between the corral with Esteban and the library shelf that Winifred had built beside the fireplace, and who had recently been introduced to his first proper reader and taken to it with a concentration so total that meals had to be announced 3 times. Clara, at 1, was a different sort, entirely sociable and laughing, and apparently determined to touch every surface in the house, a project she was pursuing with impressive thoroughness. Winifred watched her children one Sunday afternoon, William reading in the chair beside the fire and Clara on the floor pulling herself to standing at the chair leg with an expression of absolute concentration, and Arthur came in from outside and stood in the doorway for a moment watching all of them. The children, the firelight, Winifred looking up from her own reading to meet his eyes, and his face had the expression she had first seen when he held William in the November light. The full, open, unguarded version of everything. "Come in out of the cold," she said. He came in. He closed the door behind him. He picked up Clara, who immediately grabbed his ear, and he sat down in the other chair by the fire and looked across at Winifred over Clara's head. "I've been thinking," he said. "You're always thinking," she said. "I've been thinking about what I said when you arrived here, that I didn't believe in love. I remember. I was wrong," he said. "Completely wrong. I want you to know that I know that." "I know you know," she said, "but I wanted to say it explicitly. Because you said something that night that I've thought about many times since, and I want to say it back to you." "What did I say?" "You said I didn't have to decide in advance, that I couldn't have it." He was looking at her steadily, Clara still attached to his ear. "You were right, and I did have it. I always had it. I just didn't know what I was feeling because I'd talked myself out of knowing." "You were feeling things about a woman who arrived on a half-dead mule," she said. "I was," he said. She had no idea where she was going to sleep or whether there was even a school to teach in, and she looked at this town like she was going to love it regardless. He paused. "I had never seen anything like it." Winifred looked at her husband across the firelit room, with their son deep in a book and their daughter conducting an examination of his ear, and she thought about the porch of the church hall and the November night and the forehead to forehead and the first morning in Cutter's Creek and the whole long sweep of what had been, and she felt it, the full weight and breadth of it, the undeniable, irreversible, irresistible truth of it. "I love you, Arthur Wilcox," she said. "I love you, Winifred Wilcox," he said. "More than I know how to say, and twice as much as I show, and more each year than the year before." "That was remarkably articulate," she said. "I've been practicing," he said. She laughed, and the fire crackled, and William looked up from his book to observe his laughing mother and his father with his sister on his lap, and returned to his book with the satisfaction of a 5-year-old for whom the world was exactly as it should be. They stayed at the Double W for all of their lives. The ranch grew, and the school grew, and the town grew, and Cutter's Creek by the late 1880s was a proper small town with a bank and a proper hotel, and a barber shop that had expanded, and a doctor's office that had become a small clinic when Dr. Fitch trained a young man from San Antonio to assist him. The train came through 3 times a week and brought mail and goods, and occasionally people who stayed, adding themselves to the particular character of the place. Esteban's children grew up alongside William and Clara, which was a fact of daily life at the Double W that no one considered remarkable except for people new to the area, who sometimes made comments that received the same expression from Winifred that Garrett Cole had received, the one that made it very clear the comment had not worked. Arthur's response to the same comments was simpler. He said Esteban Vega had been with him since the beginning, and was as much a part of the Double W as the timber and the creek, and the conversation ended there. David Reyes came back to Cutter's Creek in 1887 as a licensed attorney, the first in the county, which was a day of considerable celebration. Clem Garrity went to Austin to study engineering and sent letters back that were dense with numbers and enthusiasm. Me Garrity, now 14, was the best student in the school and was being prepared by Betsy Walsh for examination at a women's academy in Dallas. And on a warm evening in September of 1888, 10 years after a woman arrived in Cutter's Creek on a half-dead mule with a single battered trunk, Arthur Wilcox and Winifred Wilcox sat on the porch of the Double W and watched the last of the light leave the sky over the western pasture, and the cottonwoods were turning gold along the creek, and somewhere in the house William was reading to Clara, who was 4 now and had recently decided that books were the best things in the world next to horses, which Winifred considered proof of good genetics on both sides. 10 years, Arthur said. 10 years since I arrived, she said. It will be 9 years since the wedding in April. I know, he said. I count them. So do I. He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had taken it that first time on a night in November in a cold church hall, deliberately and with full intention, and held it in the way that had never once in 10 years become a habit in the sense of something done without thought. It was always thought, always chosen, always the same weighted certainty. Are you still happy? He asked. Still asking, she said. I will always ask. I am extraordinarily happy, she said. I am happy with this ranch and this land and these children and this town. I am happy that I answered an advertisement in the Houston Chronicle. I am happy that my mule sat down in the middle of the street and I had to look at you before I even got off the animal. She paused. I am happy that you didn't offer to help me, because I think if you had been immediately charming I would not have found you nearly as interesting. I wasn't ignoring you, he said. I know. I was trying to decide what to do with the fact that you had just arrived and already looked like you were going to be important. And what did you decide? To wait, he said. To see how things went. They went well, she said. They went very well, he said, and turned to look at her in the last of the evening light, his face as fully open as it always was with her now. The door not cracked an inch but wide and permanent. Everything through it freely available to anyone who took the time to look, which mostly meant her and the children and the people who sat around the Sunday table. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the entire world contained in one place on the Texas plains. What are you thinking? She asked. I'm thinking that I was wrong about so many things, he said, and right about one. The ranch. No, he said, you. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it with the formal gravity that was so essentially him, that had never changed from the beginning, the seriousness of a man for whom nothing was done lightly. You specifically. Winifred Wilcox looked at her husband in the last September light and felt the prairie wind in her hair and heard her children's voices inside the house and the horses in the corral and the cottonwoods along the creek making their whispering sound in the evening, and she thought, this is what I came west for. Not for the job, not for a fresh start, not because she was looking for something she could name. She had come because she had believed, without evidence, that something was waiting for her in the unknown distance. She had been right. And Arthur Wilcox, who had built a ranch at 17 with nothing but a plan and a determination to fill his days with work instead of longing, who had taught himself that the capacity for love was something he had simply missed, that man was sitting beside her in the September evening, holding her hand as the last light fell out of the sky, and he was the most certain thing in her world, and she was the most certain thing in his. "It's a beautiful evening," she said. "It is," he said. "Come inside when the stars come out," she said. "William has been asking to show you something in the geography book." "I'll be in," he said. She stood and smoothed her dress and looked at the land one more time, the gold trees, the darkening sky, the pasture going blue in the dusk, the sweep and breadth of Texas under a sky that was beginning to show its first stars. It was the same land she had looked at from Clara Beaumont's window on the day she arrived, uncertain and tired and entirely determined, and it was hers now as much as anything was ever anyone's, as much as the school was hers and the children and the Sunday table and the man on the porch. She went inside. Arthur sat a little longer, as was his way, looking at the land he had built from nothing, and he felt what he felt with the full awareness of a man who had learned not to name it in advance, but simply to let it be what it was. It was the land in the rain at the end of a dry summer. It was the hawk on the fence post. It was the poem read on a post office porch and the books on the schoolhouse step, and the first morning that Winifred Chandler rode into Cutter's Creek, Texas, and looked at a town she had never seen before as if she already knew she was going to love it. He stayed until the stars came out, which was not long. Then he went inside.